I'm here to talk about software for cities with these fine folks next to me. Thank you for joining me. I am not going to take too much time here on the mic, except that I really think we have the real data brokers, the real power brokers here on stage. So I suggest maybe if you haven't grabbed food, you grab some and come back very quickly. I'm going to allow the panel to introduce themselves. And we're going to start with SIGRID.
Hi everyone, thanks for staying despite all the delicious food trucks which are lurking outside. My name is Sigrid, I'm head of marketing and communications for Trafi, and if you're traveling through Berlin today, I am hoping that you're using a solution which is powered by our technology, which is the new Berlin transportation app Jelbi, which we're doing in collaboration with BVG, which is the public transit authority here locally. Super happy to be here, and I'll leave it over to Tammy.
Hi everyone, my name is Tammy. I work at Wunder Mobility. I'm the Chief Mobility Evangelist and Head of Partnerships. As Sigrid mentioned, I would love if you had the chance as well to use them, and maybe with one of our partners. We are currently offering a solution for EMI, for example, here in Berlin. So it's a huge pleasure to be here today.
I'm KIRN. I'm CEO of INVERS. We build IoT and software for mobility providers, from shuttles, moped sharing, scooter sharing. Work also together with Wunder. So EMI is also was one of our first micromobility customers, Coop. So maybe you can also use some of our services, which are usually invisible. So we're also a mobility tech company.
Thanks. Also very happy to be here. My name is Diego Canales. I'm from Populus. Basically, we're a platform that intersects between cities and operators, whether that's scooters, mopeds, also car share, and we are able to broker that data sharing between cities and operators. So we help cities basically get analytics, insights of what's happening, whether for regulation purposes or sometimes for longer, medium-term planning about what type of infrastructure they should put in place. So basically that's what we do.
Thanks, everyone. So when we're thinking about cities, we're really thinking about the owners of the infrastructure. And the infrastructure that we're talking about are the roads that we own collectively. And cities need to make decisions how to best use that infrastructure. And as Horace was talking about earlier, we're seeing this disruption with micromobility. So it's really been fascinating to see how cities have been responding. We know San Francisco was banning scooters right away and then sort of slowly allowing them to come back on board onto the roads. And then Los Angeles DOT has now been playing around with data and how exactly we're supposed to be sharing that data. In Europe, it's very fascinating to see how this is playing out, especially with Wunder Mobility and what Jelbi is now allowing for. And Populus is also out in the Middle East. And INVERS is sort of across the whole ecosystem. I'd like to start with INVERS, and if you could tell us exactly how you started. I mean, when we spoke earlier, you told me you were the original creator of vehicle sharing.
Yeah, so the story of INVERS goes back to '93, and the founder, Uwe, he was really into micromobility, riding his bike, but he realized sometimes he needs a car. And he's from a city in Germany called Siegen with about 100,000 people, and wanted to start, at the time, a car-sharing company, but figured it actually doesn't work there. It's a hilly city, there's not enough customers for a vehicle, so he focused as an electrical engineer on building the technology and selling it worldwide, and that led to the invention of the first standard car-sharing onboard unit. That's how we sort of developed it, and nowadays we continuously evolved it into micromobility and brought sort of the vehicle in the cloud.
So you're actually dealing with onboard units with micromobility.
That's one piece, and then sort of software also became more and more important. That's our link to cities. So we work for the operators. We empower operators and especially entrepreneurs that want to start a service. To run it, which comprises the IoT, comprises also back-end components, where all this data is being generated. Our customers, they own the data, and so they pass it on to partners like cities.
So when you're talking about, and what we're really going to be talking about is the data, you're basically the data warehouse because you're collecting the data right off of the unit. What problems are you having with actually collecting that data, for example, in urban canyons? Yeah,
so that's also something that we heard in the previous panel. In theory, it works all very smoothly, but in a shared mobility service, you're talking about distributed vehicles working in urban canyons where GPS positioning is quite difficult, but it's also quite important because it matters on which side of the street a vehicle is. So there's a lot of research going on. So having accurate and precise data, that's we see as our job, and providing it in a data warehouse, and then sort of passing it on to partners for the analysis.
Exactly. So you're passing it on to partners such as Populus or Wunder Mobility and possibly even Trafi, although we'll get into that. So can you actually pass your microphone over to Diego and you can talk about how Populus is actually interacting with cities? And what I'd like to hear from you, because Populus is a little different than possibly Wunder City's solution here, you're actually customizing data feeds for cities, is that correct?
Yeah, so cities are our main customers, and the data feeds that we receive, fortunately, most of them, a lot of them are standardized. So there's a couple standards out there that have been, one of them, as you mentioned, is actually Los Angeles city. They created what is called a mobility data specification. It's very common. Now it's been out there for a year. It's a standard that's able to get supply, but also demand side data, which is something we had not seen before in standards. There's also the general bike share feed specification, which is the GBFS. That's been out there for like 5 years, mostly for dock-based bike sharing systems. Now it's been adapted to be able to get free floating. So that's something, 2 types of feeds that we get, but we also get other type of feeds whenever a operator is not having us standardized data. So we work with that. We're not married to any standard, but any standard makes our lives easier whenever we get data. And so cities also like that, so that they get the same type of data from all the operators, and a lot of them require that on their regulations. At least in the US, it's very common that.
So what are you doing in other cities in other countries?
So other countries are following what the US is doing. I'm speaking for Latin America, for example. Buenos Aires and Bogota are 2 cities that are already requiring MDS and GBFS. Now, Europe's a little bit different because cities do want that data, but there's a little bit of some hurdles to basically go over, which is GDPR, which is a directive by the European Union about the privacy laws for the data. So we're working with partners, European cities, to try to figure out how can we are able to get data that's rich and we can get insights from, but that doesn't kind of basically break that directive from the European Union.
I'm really interested in this data privacy aspect that you're bringing up. So MDS has sort of been standardized by Los Angeles DOT, and then the EU has the GDPR. Can you just highlight some of the differences in the data feed that you're going to be getting? Yeah,
so we haven't been able to figure out exactly what an MDS that's complying with GDPR would look like, but we have an idea, which is like you have trips data, the trip data, then you have also the traces of the route, which that under GDPR directive is considered as a PII, personal identifiable information, that goes along in the MDS. So the question is whether we strip out those type of data, or will we anonymize even more or aggregate the MDS feed, which is basically raw data, before getting out of the operator. So that's different kind of perspective we're looking at to solve that GDPR issue.
So you were saying, just if you could reiterate, what is the piece that you want to strip out?
The trips data that has like the traces of the trip. So it's trip data, origin, destination, but you also have the trace data from the GPS. Okay. So basically all the different points with timestamps, X, Y, every 30, 40 seconds, whatever it is, that gives you the whole trace of the trip. But that under GDPR is supposed to be PII information, because even though it's anonymized, there's algorithms and there's been research that shows that with trip data that's that precise, you can identify persons with other kind of databases and so on.
All right, so we're getting really into the weeds here. PII, for those of you who don't know, is personally identifiable information. And there's a large controversy with privacy. Privacy really cannot be defined. And Snowden's just written a new book. You could read that. I can tell you a little bit more. But there's this big issue with re-identifying data. So even if you strip the PII, there's a theory that you could still identify the data if you line it up with different sources of data.
Well, it's actually not a theory. Something that happened in, I think, 2015, New York City released TLC data, which was data from taxi information data they had with trips. And some people got that data and they applied some algorithms on the research saying, yes, we can re-identify based on the data you opened up. So that gave a big backlash to the open data movement of that you could share that type of data with the public, which is basically you can't. So that's a premise.
Right. So this is interesting because cities are kind of trying to regain control of the roads and be able to pull different levers and develop different policies to serve us, the customers and the citizens. And I'd like to turn it over to SIGRID here so you could talk about Hjälby, which is just launched, congratulations, and talk about how you're actually working with cities and giving them the power to actually change infrastructure kind of more firsthand than we've seen traditionally with a MaaS solution.
Thank you. Yes, so our approach is twofold. What we want to do with cities is, first of all, to create one city-based platform for all different types of mobility, where the city is the owner of the platform. So instead of jumping between 25 different types of mobility apps, you would have everything in just one solution. And this is something that you can already access today in Berlin via Hjälby, where we have more than 12 different types of transportation modes deeply integrated into one service, meaning you don't have to register for additional services or go through identification processes. It's just a one-stop shop for mobility. Obviously, this type of platform has another advantage when it comes to the city-facing end, which is that you gain insights to how your exact mobility network is actually moving. Instead of going to private providers and asking them to give you the data for how it is utilized, you actually track it in real time. So what we can provide the cities with are not only knowledge about how their transport network is beating, analytics of how to manage it, but also a predictive tool of how to see how it's going to develop in the future. So if we can track user demand and see how it's going to change, not only in the upcoming 12 hours, but in the upcoming 12 months, then we can really create infrastructure and policy which is based on simulations rather than assumptions. So this is what we're doing now together with Berlin, and we're expanding through other cities in Europe this year and next year.
Great, thank you. And you're actually doing this across all modes. So cities would then, Berlin, for example, would then have the power to design different policies, pull different levers to push one mode over the other. And you've been running since?
We have been so Hjälby was launched in a test pilot about 3 months ago. Earlier this September, it was officially launched. And we have approximately 12 different modes of mobility, which is covering all the various types that you can travel through Berlin, plus walking, of course. And what is the, I would say, huge benefit for citizens is that you see all different modes transparently, how much they're going to cost, how long it's going to take. You can compare, you can travel from A to B, but you can also just pick up your phone and take something which is close by. So instead of trying to research everything, which I've also been doing for many years, you have it all in the palm of your hand. So in terms of making mobility accessible, not only in the hotspots of the city, but also seeing what we can push out to the suburbs, this is a really great tool, not only for cities, but also for users. So I hope that everyone sitting in this room will download Hjälby. If you have any feedback, you can reach out to me anytime. But our main idea is really to make it easy for citizens to move around the city and for the cities to understand how and why they are doing so.
Right, and you're directly partnered with the transportation provider
Yes.
here. So this is an inverse of what we've seen. There are other MaaS solutions and providers out there that are not necessarily partnered with cities, but partnered with operators and have their own they have their own app. And you've developed this in partnership with a transportation provider so that they essentially have all of that data. They then own the data, don't they?
Precisely. So we can process the data, we can analyze the data, but the data is owned by the city. And we want it to be that way because the city is ultimately the ones who are not only providing the physical infrastructure, but also policy. And if they don't know what's going on within their city limits, they can't do policy, which is following new demands, new types of mobility, or causing any type of problems that we see now with parking zones, etc. If you don't know where they should be, how are you going to be able to put them there? So we're really trying to give back the information to the cities, make the cities great again, or whatever buzzword you would want to attach to that. But the point is that we're making sure that the information flows are not stuck with various providers or with users. So instead of having private operators sitting on their data, citizens not communicating how they want to travel to the city, we force it all into one platform. And this means that the way that you can understand mobility is going from a public transit agency's point of view, gathering content by asking Herr und Frau Müller in the street how they are traveling today, to actually being able to see it in real time. So in one word, what we're doing is we're creating a digital twin of the physical reality when it comes to mobility.
And that's giving, again, cities the power.
It's giving
and
the cities
information.
the power. Yes.
So let's talk about Wunder City. TANY, RIBEIRO. Can you talk about your pilot project with Hamburg and how that's been taking off?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started actually this partnership with Hamburg City a few months ago. And the idea, as Sigrid mentioned, is to bring power back to the cities. What we see is that in the past, all the cities had full control of public transportation, and we see a lot of new mobility service coming to the cities. And somehow, for example, scooter sharing came in the last 2-3 years. We didn't have it, we didn't expect it. And what happened is that right now, the cities realized that they had to understand, citizens are pushing them to have new mobility service because they understand the benefit of it, but they were losing control. They were not understanding what was going on actually in their own cities. So we actually decided to join forces with Hamburg to work on a report and a dashboard actually to understand as well in real time, check all the data from the operators, to check what are the citizens' needs, what are the commuters doing to try to offer better mobility service, and yeah, based on demand, based on their needs, and really try to provide the service that fits the citizens, not what the startups or corporates are willing to launch. Because right now they are launching, and we could not understand yet if it was necessary, what type of vehicle they were needing, depending on the region, for example. And I see that, as mentioned several times in the last months, data is the new oil, and we are trying to provide it to the city now.
Great. So all of you are working with cities on the one hand and then operators on the other. And Alex, over at INVERS, you talk about empowering the entrepreneur. Can you talk about that a little bit more here?
Yeah, so in our mind, I mean, when you also think about a city, I mean, what the city wants is to create an attractive mobility offering for their citizens. And what we've seen, I mean, being sort of in the mobility industry for 20 plus years, the change is really driven by entrepreneurs. And that's what we found and defined as our customer group, is building them the tools to launch mobility services faster and more reliably, and to run them profitably. And I think for a city, especially in this environment, it's also important to create an attractive field for entrepreneurs to launch and run their services profitably. And at the moment, it feels like, I mean, there are a lot of kick scooters, but we're still in sort of MVP phase. And so we need to find both the cities and the entrepreneurs running it. What are the rules, the guidelines to operate these services? And part of it can be solved by software, but part of it is also, I think, just pragmatic and sensible rules and an operating environment. Because ultimately, I think, I mean, if you look at the adoption of micromobility, it's just phenomenal. I mean, citizens want it. There's clear proof. Many of these companies are still sort of heavily venture-backed, so I think ultimately they also need to reach profitability. And so I think that's in the interest of all of us, and figuring out what is the path to that. I think that's in our mind, that's what where we can contribute some standard technology pieces that make it more profitable, but there's also a lot of other factors that influence that.
Great, thank you. And Tammy, you were talking a little bit earlier today when we were chatting about working both with cities and developing those partnerships, and then with the operators. Can you describe that experience for you in Hamburg?
Yeah, definitely. I think that when it comes to, again, data is super valuable today. So we were talking about the difficulty actually for operators to understand that it's necessary to share, because the data right now, the data know by the end who should benefit the citizen, not actually startups they're launching or any corporate by the end. So that's why we truly believe that cities should have the power back in order to have control of the data and, again, offer what's valuable actually for the citizens in the end. Yeah.
And so how easy was that for you to get the information from the operators?
It is still not easy. So actually the city had to come with an agreement for them to operate there. So it's not an option right now. If they want to operate in the city, they need to provide data. So it was a prerequisite for them.
And the cities also, with that permit or however they're bringing that down with the operators, they're describing exactly the types of data that they need to be providing?
Absolutely, yes.
And do you know exactly what Hamburg is looking for in terms of their metrics, without giving away anything that's under NDA?
The metrics, exactly. Right now, as I mentioned, we are with an NDA, so I cannot share that. But again, the idea is to follow GDPR, of course, and to try to understand, what are the communities partners and how can they actually offer a better service. I cannot share the metrics specifically, sorry.
Well, it's interesting because you would think that all cities kind of want to answer the same questions. But obviously with MDS and GDPR, there's different questions that can, have answers. Can anyone on this panel talk about different cities they've been working with that have different priorities?
I think I can. So it's interesting. Well, first of all, cities that we work with, some of them have a regulatory process where there's an operating permit so that they allow micromobility, and then they specify exactly indicators they want to look at. One of them is like vehicle counts, very specifically, how many vehicles you can have on the ground. Some cities in the US, you see a lot of equity component is very strong. And so they want to see that at least a certain percentage of the fleet has to be deployed in areas of the city where there's low-income communities. So they want to see that very strongly. And so they measure that, and they use us as a platform to be able to measure that. Deployments, they have different metrics, but basically it's like a percentage levels of service, minimum levels of service in certain areas. In other cities, which Portland, for example, has very interesting indicators. They are tilted to environmental also kind of indicators, and they're looking, something they required was a study on the VMT produced by the operations of, we have picking up and charging, all that, the scooters, the VMT that was being produced by the vehicles that were being used. And so if you were to first of all, measure it, submit a plan to see how you're going to address it. And so they have incentives put in place in the regulation, which is you can have X% more of scooters if you're complying with this. Also, they're looking at the life cycle analysis, which is something not a lot of cities have been putting attention to, but Portland was specifically looking at, okay, I don't know the numbers exactly, but I know they wanted to get a life cycle assessment of the vehicles. And then if they were lasting more than X amount of time, then also you were able to put more scooters on the ground. Utilization rates is something they want to look, performance, about how the vehicles are performing. They're looking also at parking. So how are you parking, no parking zones? How are you complying with that? I think I covered, it's efficiency, environmental, safety. Safety is something we still need to tackle, which is speeds. Okay, speed is one piece of that, but then you also have to look at what's happening with fatalities, near collisions, things that are not actively yet mapped in the scooter because there's not enough sensors. So you just have a GPS, and from that, you cannot derive a lot of things in terms of safety. And a lot of these are self-reported from the user, so we still have to tackle how we get more data on safety in order to improve it for the user.
I think for the cities that we approach and that approach us, we see 4 main areas of interest, where the 4th point might come as a surprise, so I'll keep that for last. Where the first one is really a sustainable point, where they see what can we do in order to make people leave their private cars at home, as in how can we incentivize shared mobility through our network by connecting others to us, so we become the go-to source for mobility. Secondly, to lower the barriers for trying out new mobility, and also thus connecting it to public transportation, as in how can we make new modes of mobility not cannibalize our own service, but rather build on top. Third one is being able to understand what the heck is going on here. Like, kick scooters were not allowed up until a few months ago in Berlin. Now they're all over the place. What does that mean for the city as a whole? What does it mean for our infrastructure, policy making, etc.? And the 4th one is actually a very, very strong competition between cities. Cities, at least in Europe, they want to lead the way. And if you're slow, you're not. So it also has a sense of local pride, of being first in the game, of being able to show to your politicians that, hey, we're in it. We can actually launch something which our citizens want. We're not going to do it in 5 years, we're going to do it this year. And if you're going to do it this year, you need to have a tech partner on board, and that's where we come in.
Yeah, can you talk about that a little bit? How quickly Trafi was able to work on also with Yelby, but also ticketing, integrating ticketing into that, which in the States I hear that is the hardest problem to solve, and it involves blockchain and all of these other pieces.
Sure. So our white label solution, which is applied here in Berlin, is including ticketing, identification processes, payments, everything. And it's basically a plug-and-play type of solution. And the most time-consuming part is not having that in place, but it's to get the private partners on board. So if you want to create a one-stop shop for mobility, you have to have a lot of things in your shop. You don't want to go to Spotify and maybe have 10 bands that you can choose from. You want to have the full range. Whether you're feeling like folklore, jazz, or Mozart, you want to have it in there. And it's the same for any type of platform that strives to be a platform for mobility. You have to include it all, not just 1 or 2 things. So now in September we started with 12 different modes, but this is just the beginning. If you want to become the Amazon for transportation, like someone mentioned earlier, you have to be an Amazon. You can't just be, I don't know, Target 5 years ago. Excuse the language.
Well, but go back to the timing of this, because you launched here in September, you did some beta testing. When did your conversations with the city of Berlin start?
So our conversations with Berlin started in October last year. We began to work on the service in January. We went into test phase in May, and it was officially launched now in September.
That's definitely rapid prototyping right there. So congratulations on that. Going back to the blockchain, Alex, you have some ideas about that, don't you, with INVERS?
Yeah, we did a test project with it, but sort of blockchain is a technology topic, and to your point, what we also noticed, I mean, technology is really not the hurdle. I mean, it's really the relationships and politics involved and economic decisions. But nevertheless, still, blockchain is, I think, a promising avenue. So what we built is a prototype for a scooter rental that actually can be rented on the blockchain. Because we're a tech company, so we're curious to actually really figure it out and not talk about it. And what we learned is technology is still early, so you do need quite some time to actually process a transaction, and if it's raining and you want to get to the vehicle, it's just too long. But I think the promise is there for actually even sort of cementing the data ownership to the user. The city can also enforce more, let's say, like a deposit for that it's guaranteed that the vehicle is being removed when it's broken. So it helps really put the regulation in code, so to speak. But I think it's, in our mind, I mean, talking again about the MVP approach, it's still too early. And when you also said you need to aggregate the whole spectrum of mobility options, I mean, in Berlin, they are there, but in other cities, there might be just kick scooters. And in our mind, that's just the beginning. So you need to really, to get rid of the car, you need to have a city covering a whole range of mobility options. And then sort of you can go the next step, and blockchain is even 2 or 3 steps further away.
Well, I'm sorry, but our time's actually run out, which is really quickly. We had a quick 30 minutes, but I just want to thank all of these panelists for being here. I really feel like you are the kingpins in the room, because you're actually talking to both the operators and the cities, and you actually hold the key to information that cities need and operators need, but also you're doing a really good job around the world. We didn't get a chance to talk about this, but also informing cities of what they need to do to incorporate micromobility. So thank you very much for your work, and thank you for spending time here today. Thank you.